when 38-year-old Rebecca Hartley signed the purchase agreement for a dilapidated barn in the remote Cascade Mountains of Washington state with her last $12,000, the locals in Pinehaven thought grief and desperation had driven her to complete madness. But hidden beneath decades of rotting hay bales and forgotten farming equipment lay evidence of a World War II-era conspiracy that would expose one of the Pacific Northwest's most powerful timber dynasties and restore justice to a mountain community that had been silenced for nearly 80 years. For what Rebecca and her loyal German Shepherd, Ranger, uncovered in that crumbling structure would prove that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried in time and timber, refuse to stay hidden forever. Before we dive into this incredible journey of discovery, courage, and justice, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. And if stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary strength inspire you the way they inspire us, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got another story lined up that will absolutely leave you speechless. The December morning was bitterly cold as Rebecca Hartley's 10-year-old Honda CR-V labored up the steep mountain highway toward Pinehaven, Washington. Ice crystals formed at the edges of the windshield despite the heater running at full blast. In the passenger seat, Ranger, her 4-year-old German Shepherd, pressed his dark nose against the frosted window, his breath creating small circles of fog as he watched the towering Douglas firs blur past in an endless parade of green and white. In the back of the vehicle, Rebecca's entire life was compressed into 7 cardboard boxes, 2 worn duffel bags, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and a small camping stove. At 38 years old, this was what remained after a year that had systematically dismantled everything she'd built over 2 decades of responsible, cautious living. The GPS showed another 40 minutes to her destination, though the satellite signal flickered uncertainly this deep in the mountains. Rebecca gripped the steering wheel tighter as the road narrowed, the guardrails becoming less frequent, the drop-offs more precipitous. She'd never been good with heights, and the sheer cliffs falling away to her right made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Almost there, Ranger," she said softly, more to calm herself than to inform the dog. "Our new home. Our fresh start." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Fresh start. As if you could simply restart your life like a computer, clearing all the painful data and beginning with a clean slate. As if the past year hadn't happened. As if David hadn't died. The year that broke everything. 12 months ago, Rebecca had been Mrs. Rebecca Hartley, 5th-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary in Portland, Oregon. She and her husband David had owned a small but comfortable bungalow in a decent neighborhood. They'd been saving for a long-delayed honeymoon to Italy. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable, predictable, safe. Then David collapsed during his morning run. The doctors said it was a massive heart attack, the kind that kills instantly. Undiagnosed coronary artery disease, the silent killer they call it. He was 41 years old, ran 5 miles 3 times a week, didn't smoke, barely drank. It didn't matter. One moment he was alive, planning their weekend, kissing her goodbye at the door. The next, he was gone. The grief was crushing, but it was the financial aftermath that truly destroyed her. David's life insurance policy had lapsed 6 months earlier during a period of tight finances they'd promised themselves was temporary. Neither had thought to check on it once things stabilized. The hospital bills for the emergency response, the futile attempts at resuscitation, the autopsy, all of it fell on Rebecca. $47,000 in medical debt for a man who'd died anyway. She'd tried to hold it together. Returned to teaching after 3 weeks, moving through her days in a fog of grief and Zoloft. But something had broken inside her that couldn't be fixed. She found herself crying in the school supply closet between classes. Snapping at students over minor infractions. Staring at lesson plans as if they were written in a foreign language. The school district was sympathetic but firm. "Take a leave of absence," they suggested. "Get help. Come back when you're ready." She never went back. The house went next, unable to afford the mortgage on her teacher's salary while drowning in medical debt. She'd sold it quickly, taking a loss just to be free of it. The money from the sale barely covered what she owed. Then came the apartment, a cramped studio that still cost $1,400 a month. Portland's rental market was merciless. Her savings evaporated. Friends offered help, but there's only so much people can do, only so much charity you can accept before the shame becomes unbearable. Rebecca found herself applying for jobs she was overqualified for, being rejected because she was overqualified, caught in the cruel paradox of economic desperation. Ranger had been David's dog originally, a rescue they'd adopted 3 years ago. Now the German Shepherd was her only constant companion, the only living being who didn't look at her with pity or concern or barely concealed exhaustion with her inability to just move on. The desperate solution. It was 2 a.m. on a sleepless night in October when Rebecca had found the listing. She'd been scrolling through rural property websites with a strange mixture of desperation and dark humor. What did it matter? She couldn't afford any of them anyway. But there was something almost meditative about looking at places far from the city, far from the life she'd lost, far from everything. Then she saw it. Historic barn on 4.7 acres, Pinehaven, WA $12,000, as a sale, cash only. The photos showed a massive red barn, weathered and sagging, its roof partially collapsed on one side. It sat in an overgrown meadow with mountains rising dramatically behind it. The listing was brutally honest: severe structural damage. No utilities. No road access beyond dirt trail. Property sold as is with no warranties or guarantees. Buyer assumes all risks. Structure may not be salvageable. Land only value $12,000. Rebecca had exactly $14,500 left from the house sale after paying off David's medical bills and her own accumulating debts. It was supposed to last her until she found work, until she got back on her feet, until she figured out what came next. Looking at that listing at 2 a.m., broken, grieving, and so tired of struggling in an expensive city that didn't care, Rebecca made a decision that her therapist would later say was either the bravest or most reckless thing she'd ever done. She would buy it. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple. The property was outside Pinehaven's town limits, which meant she could legally live in an RV or trailer on the land without building permits. She'd buy a used camper with her remaining $2,500. She'd live there while she figured out what to do with the barn. Demolish it, maybe, or if portions were salvageable, renovate it slowly. The land itself was worth something. Property in Washington was always worth something. It was insane. It was impulsive. It was probably stupid. But it was also $12,000 for land in a structure, versus $1,400 a month for a Portland studio where the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors' every argument, where the parking lot had been broken into twice, where she'd sit alone every evening wondering how her life had become so small and so hard. The purchase. The sale process was surprisingly quick. The property had been in foreclosure, owned by the county after years of unpaid property taxes. The previous owner, a man named Harold Garrett, had died 5 years earlier with no living relatives and significant debts. The county just wanted the property off their books. Rebecca dealt with a tired-sounding clerk named Margaret who processed the paperwork with the enthusiasm of someone filing forms in purgatory. "You seen the property?" Margaret had asked over the phone. "I've seen the photos." "And you understand it's being sold as is? No guarantees on the structure's integrity, no utilities, no." "I understand." A pause. Then, more gently, "May I ask what you plan to do with it?" "Live there," Rebecca said simply. Another pause, longer this time. "The barn is not suitable for habitation, Ms. Hartley. It's dangerous. Parts of the roof have collapsed. I'll get a trailer. I just need the land." Margaret sighed the sigh of a woman who'd seen many poor decisions but wasn't paid enough to argue. "As long as you understand what you're purchasing." "I do." She didn't, really. But she signed the papers anyway. The real estate agent who handled the final paperwork was a leathery woman in her 60s named Diane Porter, who drove out to meet Rebecca at a coffee shop in the nearest larger town, Millbrook, about 40 minutes from Pinehaven. "I'm obligated to tell you this is probably not a wise investment," Diane said, spreading the documents across the coffee-stained table. Harold Garrett, the previous owner, he was a recluse. Lived in that barn for decades after his house burned down in the 70s. Never rebuilt. Just kind of existed out there. When he died, the county found him 3 weeks later. The barn's been sitting empty since then. What was he like? Rebecca found herself asking. Diane's expression shifted, became thoughtful. Old. Eccentric. But sharp, you know? There were stories about him in town. People said he was paranoid, always talking about things that happened during the war, World War II, I mean. He'd been just a kid then, but he claimed his father had told him things before he died. Secrets about Pinehaven, about the timber companies. She shrugged. Most people thought he was just a crazy old man living in the past. What kind of secrets? The kind desperate old men invent to make their lives seem more important than they were, probably, Diane said, not unkindly. Look, Pinehaven's a small town. Maybe 1,200 people. The Thornburg Timber Company has owned most of the land around here for generations. They're not there anymore, corporate buyout in the 80s, but the Thornburg family still has influence. Old money, you know? Harold always claimed they'd stolen land from families during the war, but there was never any proof. Just an old man's bitter stories. Rebecca signed the papers. Diane watched her with a mixture of pity and resignation. The property's about 8 miles outside town on Old Cascade Road. Road's paved for the first 6 miles, then it's dirt and gravel. The turnoff to the barn is easy to miss, just a gap in the trees with a rusted mailbox that says Garrett. Trail's rough. You'll want 4-wheel drive. I have an old CRV. That should make it. Just take it slow. Diane gathered the papers, then hesitated. You running from something, hon? Rebecca looked up, surprised by the directness. Or running to something? Diane continued. Because that barn isn't going to solve whatever problem you're carrying. It's just going to give you a different set of problems. Maybe I need different problems, Rebecca said quietly. Diane nodded slowly. Fair enough. Welcome to Pinehaven, Ms. Hartley. I hope you find what you're looking for out there. Arrival in Pinehaven. The town of Pinehaven appeared suddenly as Rebecca rounded a curve in the mountain highway. One moment there was only forest and rock, the next, a small cluster of buildings emerged from the wilderness like something from another era. Main Street was exactly that, one street, maybe half a mile long, with buildings on both sides that looked like they'd been transplanted from the 1940s and left to age naturally. A general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign. A diner called the Timberline with frost on its windows. A post office no bigger than a 1-car garage. A gas station with old-fashioned pumps that might or might not accept credit cards. A few pickup trucks were parked diagonally along the street. 2 people walked on the sidewalk, bundled against the cold. It was 11 a.m. on a Wednesday, and the town felt empty, suspended in time, forgotten by the larger world. Rebecca drove through slowly, ranger alert and watchful in his seat. A few faces turned to watch the unfamiliar vehicle pass. In a town this small, she realized, everyone would know within hours that a stranger had arrived. She stopped at the general store, needing supplies before heading to the property. Inside, it was warmer and smelled of coffee and sawdust. The shelves were well stocked but organized with a utilitarian simplicity, canned goods, basic staples, work gloves, batteries, flashlights, hand tools. This was a store for people who lived in the mountains, not tourists. An elderly man behind the counter looked up from a newspaper. Help you find something? Just some basics, Rebecca said. Water, food, flashlight batteries. He nodded, returning to his paper while she gathered supplies. When she brought her items to the counter, he rang them up with slow deliberation on an ancient cash register. Passing through, he asked, not looking up. Actually, I just bought property here. The old Garrett place. Now he looked up, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp attention. Harold's barn? Yes. He studied her for a long moment. You know that place isn't fit for living. I've been told. I'm planning to get a trailer. He bagged her items carefully. Harold was a good man. Troubled, maybe, but good. Died alone out there. Sad way to go. Did you know him well? Well as anyone could. He didn't come to town much. When he did, he'd buy his supplies, maybe have coffee at the diner, then head back into the mountains. Last few years, he barely came at all. We should have checked on him more. A pause. I'm Hank, by the way. Hank Morrison. I've run this store 42 years. Rebecca Hartley. Welcome to Pinehaven, Ms. Hartley. You need anything, you come see me. Radio's spotty out at Harold's place, cell service is non-existent, but the landline still works if you get it turned back on. Thank you. As she turned to leave, Hank spoke again. One more thing. You find anything unusual out there, anything that seems like it might be important, you might want to be careful who you talk to about it. Rebecca turned back. What do you mean? But Hank was already returning to his newspaper, his face carefully neutral. Just saying. Small town. Long memories. Sometimes the past is better left buried. The words followed Rebecca back to her car, settling over her like the cold mountain mist. Old Cascade Road wound through increasingly dense forest as Rebecca left Pinehaven behind. The pavement was cracked and frost-heaved, patched with repairs that spoke of minimal maintenance budgets. At the 6-mile marker, just as Diane had warned, the pavement ended abruptly, replaced by hard-packed dirt and gravel. The CRV handled it adequately, though Rebecca had to slow to a crawl to navigate the ruts and washouts from recent rains. Ranger had given up on the window view and now lay in his seat, occasionally lifting his head to assess their progress. Almost there, Rebecca murmured again, the mantra that had carried her through this whole insane journey. The mailbox appeared on her right, a rusted metal box on a leaning post, the name Garrett still faintly visible in sun-faded paint. Behind it, almost hidden by overgrown brush, was a gap in the trees. Rebecca turned carefully onto what could barely be called a trail. Branches scraped against the car's sides. The track was rutted deep, forcing her to navigate slowly, the CRV rocking and lurching. This had clearly once been a maintained driveway, but 5 years of neglect had allowed nature to begin reclaiming it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, the forest opened up suddenly into a large clearing. And there it was. The barn. Rebecca stopped the car and just stared. The barn was massive, far larger than the photos had suggested. It rose from the overgrown meadow like a wounded giant, its red paint weathered to a mottled patchwork of rust and silvered wood. The structure had to be at least 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a pitched roof that soared to perhaps 30 feet at its peak. The southern side still stood relatively intact, though the siding was missing boards in places, creating gaps that revealed darkness within. The northern side was where the damage was most severe, the roof had partially collapsed inward, and one wall leaned at a precarious angle, held up more by stubbornness than structural integrity. But despite its condition, there was something magnificent about it. This barn had been built by people who understood timber, who had taken trees from these very mountains and shaped them into something meant to last generations. The bones were still good, Rebecca could see that even from a distance. The massive posts and beams were solid old-growth timber, the kind they didn't cut anymore, the kind that didn't rot or weaken easily. The meadow surrounding the barn was waist-high with dead grass and wildflowers gone to seed. A small creek, more of a stream, really, ran along the eastern edge of the property, its water clear and swift, gurgling over smooth stones. Beyond everything, the Cascade Mountains rose in layers of green and gray and white, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. It was breathtaking. It was terrifying. It was hers. Ranger was suddenly alert, whining softly, his tail beginning to wag. The dog had always loved new places to explore. "Okay, boy," Rebecca said, opening the door. "Let's see what we've bought." The cold hit her immediately, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow and wood smoke from some distant chimney. Ranger leaped out, immediately beginning to quarter the meadow in wide arcs, nose down, tail up, glorying in the space and the smells. Rebecca pulled her jacket tighter and walked slowly toward the barn. The ground was uneven, hidden by the tall grass, forcing her to move carefully. As she got closer, she could see more details: the massive sliding door on the south side, hanging askew from a single rusted rail. The smaller human-sized door beside it, closed but probably not locked. The windows near the roofline, most broken, some just empty frames. She reached the small door and tested it. The handle was cold under her palm. It turned with a stiff protest, and the door swung inward on creaking hinges. Inside the barn. The interior was dim and vast, like stepping into a cathedral dedicated to agriculture and time. Shafts of pale winter sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof and walls, illuminating particles of dust that floated in the still air like snow in a snow globe. Rebecca's eyes adjusted slowly. The space was roughly divided into sections, though the divisions were informal, created by the placement of equipment and materials rather than actual walls. To her left, enormous hay bales were stacked almost to the ceiling, ancient, compressed, blackened with age and moisture. They probably weighed several 100 pounds each and would need machinery to move. To her right, old farming equipment created a kind of museum of agricultural history. A rusted plow that looked like it belonged behind a horse or ox. A manual seed spreader. Various tools hanging from nails on the wall: saws, axes, hammers, all oxidized but potentially salvageable. Straight ahead, a wooden ladder led up to a loft that ran along the southern wall. Rebecca could see the edge of more hay bales up there, and what might have been old furniture or storage. The collapsed section of roof to the north had allowed weather in, and the floor there was rotted and dangerous. But the southern two-thirds of the barn seemed relatively intact, protected by the roof that still held. "Hello?" Rebecca called out softly, not sure why. The word vanished into the emptiness without echo. Ranger pushed past her legs, his entire body vibrating with excitement. He'd been trained in search and rescue basics before David's death had ended that plan. Now his training kicked in, he moved through the space with purpose, sniffing systematically, checking corners and shadows. Rebecca followed more carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The floorboards were solid near the door but became increasingly questionable as she moved deeper into the structure. She was about to call Ranger back when the dog suddenly stopped in the far corner, near where the intact south wall met the west wall. His body language changed instantly, ears forward, tail up but still, a soft whine building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Rebecca made her way over carefully. The corner was dim, piled with what looked like more farming equipment: a broken wheelbarrow, some wooden crates, burlap sacks stiffened with age and dust. Ranger was pawing at the wall itself, that whine growing more insistent. Rebecca ran her hand along the weathered boards. They felt the same as the rest of the barn: rough, dry, solid. But when she pushed gently, testing, there was something different. The faintest give. Not the creak of old wood, but the movement of something designed to move. Her heart began to beat faster. She pushed harder, and suddenly a section of the wall, a panel about 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, shifted inward slightly. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough to reveal that it wasn't actually part of the wall at all. It was a door. A hidden door, so cleverly constructed to blend with the barn's interior that you'd never notice it unless you were specifically looking, unless you pushed against it, unless you had a dog trained to detect anomalies. Rebecca's hands were shaking now. She found the edge of the panel and pulled. It resisted, swollen from years of moisture and disuse, but after several hard tugs it suddenly gave way, swinging outward on concealed hinges, releasing a breath of cold, dry air that smelled of paper and dust and secrets. Behind the false wall was a room. Rebecca fumbled for her phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through darkness, revealing a space roughly 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep, with a ceiling that followed the barn's sloped roofline. Unlike the main barn, this room was sealed and dry. The floor was wood, solid and level. The walls were lined with rough shelving, and on those shelves sat dozens of metal boxes, the kind used for document storage in offices, gray and green and battered with age. But it was the wall opposite the door that made Rebecca's breath catch. Tacked directly to the wood was an enormous map of Pinehaven and the surrounding mountains. It had to be 4 feet by 6 feet, hand-drawn but incredibly detailed, showing not just the town but the entire valley, the mountains, the logging roads, the creek systems. Across the map were dozens of markings, red X's, circles, handwritten notes and margins, arrows connecting different locations. Beside the map hung photographs. Dozens of them, arranged in clusters, some connected by lengths of string or yarn as if mapping relationships. The photos were black and white, clearly old, judging by the clothing and vehicles, probably from the 1940s. They showed men in work clothes and logging gear, timber operations, trucks loaded with massive logs, buildings being constructed. Rebecca stepped closer, her flashlight beam moving across the photos. One showed a group of men standing in front of a large building with a sign that read Thornburg Timber Co. Another showed what appeared to be a legal document being signed, though the details were too small to read. A third showed a massive tree being cut down, men with axes and saws dwarfed by the size of the trunk. Her light moved to the shelving and the metal boxes. Each one was labeled with dates, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945. Some had additional labels, property records, testimonies, photographs, mill operations, legal documents. With trembling hands, Rebecca pulled down the box labeled 1943 Property Records. Inside, organized with meticulous care, were dozens of folders. Each folder contained documents, property deeds, tax records, legal complaints, maps showing land parcels. As Rebecca flipped through them, a pattern began to emerge. Family names, many of them appearing on multiple documents: Garrett, Morrison, Chen, Kowalski, Nakamura. And beside many of those names, in red ink, a single word: stolen. Rebecca pulled down another box, this one labeled Testimonies 1943 to 1944. Inside were handwritten statements, some typed on old manual typewriters, others written in careful longhand. She chose one at random and began to read in the dim light of her phone. My name is Thomas Morrison. I have lived in Pinehaven for 33 years. I owned 160 acres of timber land purchased legally in 1935 with money saved over 15 years of work. In March of 1943, I was approached by representatives of Thornburg Timber Company with an offer to purchase my land. I refused, as the land has been in my family and I intended to pass it to my children. In April of 1943, I received notice that my property taxes had increased by 400%. When I went to the county office to dispute this, I was told the increase was due to reassessment. I could not afford the new tax amount. In June of 1943, Thornburg Timber Company acquired my land at auction for unpaid taxes. They paid $200 for land worth $8,000. Rebecca's hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the paper. She set it carefully aside and pulled out another. My name is Janet Chen. My husband Robert and I own a small sawmill in Pinehaven. In 1942, new safety regulations were announced that required extensive and expensive upgrades to our equipment. The Thornburg-owned mill was given 2 years to comply. Our mill was given 60 days. When we could not meet the deadline, we were shut down. We lost everything. Thornburg Timber bought our property and equipment for less than half its value. Another document, this one a typed letter. My name is Harold Garrett. I am documenting what I have witnessed and what my father told me before he died in 1944. What follows is evidence of systematic theft, manipulation, and fraud committed by the Thornburg family and their timber company during the chaos of World War II. While the nation's attention was focused on the war effort, while men were dying overseas, the Thornburgs used their power and connections to steal land from families in this valley. They manipulated tax assessments. They created regulations that bankrupted small operations. They foreclosed on properties during a time when people had no ability to fight back. My father tried to stop them. Others tried to stop them. They were threatened, silenced, driven out. I am preserving this evidence because someone needs to know what happened here. Someone needs to know the truth. The letter was dated December 1944. Rebecca sat down heavily on the floor, her back against the shelving, Ranger settling beside her with a soft whiff of concern. Around her, in box after box, lay evidence of crimes committed nearly 80 years ago. Systematic, calculated theft of land and livelihoods, carried out by a powerful family while the world was distracted by war. She thought of Hank Morrison at the general store. Morrison. The same name as one of the victims in these documents. Was he a descendant? Did he know? She thought of Diane Porter mentioning that the Thornburg family still had influence in the area, even though their company was long gone. She thought of Harold Garrett, dying alone in this barn, surrounded by evidence he'd spent his life preserving but never able to expose. And she thought of herself, a widow fleeing her own grief and financial ruin, who'd bought this property hoping for nothing more than a place to hide and heal. Instead, she'd inherited a time bomb. Outside, the December afternoon was already fading toward evening, the mountains darkening against a sky going gray. Inside the hidden room, surrounded by decades of secrets, Rebecca Hartley made a decision. Whatever came next, this evidence wouldn't stay buried. Not anymore. Harold Garrett had spent his life preserving the truth, waiting for someone who might be brave enough to share it. Rebecca didn't feel brave. She felt tired and scared and overwhelmed. But she'd also lost everything already. She had nothing left to lose except the small spark of purpose that was suddenly kindling in her chest, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, her life had led her here for a reason. "Okay, Ranger," she said softly, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I guess we're not just starting over. We're finishing something someone else started." The German Shepherd looked at her with dark, intelligent eyes, tail thumping once against the floor. Outside, night was falling over the Cascade Mountains. Inside the barn, in a hidden room that had kept its secrets for nearly 80 years, the first step toward justice had finally been taken. The question now was what would happen when those secrets came to light. Rebecca spent her first night in the CRV, the back seat folded down to create a makeshift bed with her sleeping bag. Ranger curled up beside her, his warmth a comfort against the mountain cold that seeped through the vehicle's thin walls. Outside, the December darkness was absolute, no streetlights, no ambient glow from distant cities, just the vast black presence of the mountains and the brilliant, cold stars overhead. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those documents. The testimonies of families destroyed. The meticulous records Harold Garrett had kept, year after year, preserving evidence that no one had been willing to see. The red ink marking stolen properties. The photographs of men who had committed systematic fraud while the world's attention was focused on a global war. Around 3 a.m., unable to stand the confines of the car any longer, Rebecca pulled on her heavy jacket and boots and stepped out into the freezing night. Ranger immediately followed, alert despite the hour. The barn loomed against the starlight, a dark mass that seemed to hold secrets in its very timbers. Rebecca walked toward it slowly, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the frozen grass. The small door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound loud in the mountain silence. Inside, she made her way back to the hidden room, Ranger close at her heels. She'd left it open earlier, too overwhelmed to properly close the concealed door. Now she stepped inside again, surrounded by decades of carefully preserved truth. She needed to understand the full scope of what she'd found before deciding what to do with it. Documenting the evidence. As dawn broke cold and gray over the Cascades, Rebecca had been working for 3 hours straight. She'd pulled down every box, opened every folder, and was now methodically photographing documents with her phone. The pattern was devastatingly clear. Between 1942 and 1945, the Thornburg Timber Company had acquired over 3,000 acres of privately owned timberland in the Pinehaven Valley through what could only be described as systematic fraud. The methods varied, but the result was always the same: families lost their land, and Thornburg acquired it for a fraction of its value. The tactics included property tax manipulation. County assessments would suddenly skyrocket on targeted properties, making taxes impossible to pay. When families couldn't meet the inflated amounts, their land was seized and auctioned, always with Thornburg as the only bidder. Regulatory warfare: small sawmills and timber operations would receive notice of new safety or environmental regulations requiring expensive upgrades, with impossibly short deadlines to comply. Larger Thornburg operations received extended timeframes. When small operators couldn't meet the requirements, they were shut down and their assets acquired by Thornburg. Forced sales during wartime: men were overseas fighting. Women and elderly parents trying to maintain family businesses were approached with generous offers for their land. When they refused, mysterious problems would arise: equipment would break, supplies would be delayed, workers would quit. Eventually, desperate and struggling, many sold for whatever they could get. Falsified debts: several documents described loans that families claimed they'd already repaid, but bank records somehow showed outstanding balances. When they couldn't prove payment, foreclosures followed. Harold Garrett's father, William Garrett, had been a county clerk during this period. He'd witnessed the manipulation firsthand and had secretly made copies of documents, recorded testimonies, and built a comprehensive case. But William had died suddenly in 1944. The documents suggested it might not have been natural causes, though there was no proof. Young Harold, just 16 when his father died, had inherited not just property but a mission. For the next 60 years, he'd continued documenting, preserving, adding to the evidence his father had started collecting. One folder contained a particularly damning document, a letter from James Thornburg, the patriarch of the Thornburg family during the war years, to his son Robert. It was dated March 1943. The war provides unprecedented opportunity. With so many men overseas and the government focused on production, local oversight is minimal. We must move quickly to consolidate our holdings while circumstances favor us. The families will protest, but they have no resources to fight. By the time the war ends and things return to normal, our position will be unassailable. Remember, business is not about fairness, it's about recognizing opportunity when it presents itself. Rebecca photographed that letter 3 times from different angles, making sure every word was captured clearly. The scale of the theft. As morning light filtered through the gaps in the barn's walls, Rebecca compiled a list of families who had lost property according to Harold's documents. Morrison family, 160 acres of prime timberland. Chin family, sawmill and 40 acres. Kowalski family, 200 acres, including their homestead. Nakamura family, 80 acres, also documented evidence they were threatened with internment camp if they didn't sell. Garrett family, 120 acres. Rodriguez family, small logging operation and 60 acres. Johnson family, 180 acres. Peterson family, 90 acres and timber mill equipment. The list went on. 17 families in total. Over 3,000 acres. Businesses destroyed. Generational wealth stolen. And the Thornburg family had built an empire on it. Rebecca found a folder labeled Current Status 1999 in Harold's meticulous handwriting. Inside was a document tracking what had happened to the stolen land over the decades. Most of it had been logged heavily in the 1950s and 60s. Some had been sold to developers in the 1970s when land values soared. The Thornburg Timber Company itself had been sold to a larger corporation in 1983, but the Thornburg family had retained certain key parcels and had profited enormously from the sale. Harold had even tracked down descendants of the original families. Many had left Pinehaven entirely, scattered across the country. Some family lines had died out. But several descendants still lived in the area, unaware that their family's financial struggles across generations could be traced back to land stolen during World War II. The Morrison name jumped out at her. Hank Morrison, the man at the general store. According to Harold's notes, Hank was the grandson of Thomas Morrison, who had lost 160 acres in 1943. The land that should have been Hank's inheritance was now part of a luxury housing development called Cascade View Estates. Preparing to take action. By mid-morning, Rebecca had photographed over 400 documents. Her phone storage was nearly full, but she had backup. She'd brought her old laptop, and though the barn had no electricity, the laptop's battery was charged. She transferred all the photos, then uploaded them to 3 different cloud storage accounts, making sure the evidence couldn't be lost. But photographing documents was just the beginning. The question was what to do next. Rebecca sat on the floor of the hidden room, Ranger's head resting on her lap, and thought through her options. Option 1, go to the local police. But Pinehaven was a small town. If the Thornburg family still had influence here, would the police even take her seriously? Would they suppress the evidence? Option 2, contact state authorities. Better, but she was an outsider making explosive accusations against what Harold's notes described as one of the founding families of the region. Would anyone believe her? Option 3, go to the media. Possibly the safest option. Once the evidence was public, it couldn't be buried. But which media? Local papers might be compromised. She'd need to go bigger. Option 4, find the descendants of the families who'd been victimized. Build a coalition. Present a united front. But that would take time, and she wasn't sure how much time she had before someone noticed her digging into things long buried. Before she could decide, Ranger suddenly raised his head, ears forward, a low rumble building in his chest. Someone was coming. The first visitor. Rebecca quickly closed the hidden room, making sure the door was flush with the wall. She emerged into the main barn just as she heard a vehicle approaching on the dirt trail. Through a gap in the barn's siding, she watched a Ford F-250 pickup truck, new and expensive looking, pull into the clearing. It was dark blue with chrome detailing, not a working truck but a statement vehicle. 2 men got out. The first was in his 60s, tall and lean, wearing expensive outdoor clothing that looked like it had never actually been used outdoors, designer flannel, pristine hiking boots, a vest that probably cost more than Rebecca's entire wardrobe. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and even from a distance, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. The second man was younger, maybe 40, built like he spent serious time in the gym. He wore jeans and a work jacket, but his eyes moved with the practiced alertness of security or law enforcement. Rebecca stepped out of the barn, Ranger at her side. The German Shepherd's posture was alert but not aggressive, yet. "Good morning," the older man called out, his voice friendly but with an undertone of steel. "You must be Miss Hartley." "I'm Robert Thornburg." Rebecca's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Thornburg. What brings you out here?" He smiled, a politician's smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to Pinehaven. Word travels fast in a small town, and when someone new purchases property, especially historical property like this, we like to introduce ourselves. I'm president of the Pinehaven Historical Society, among other things." "That's very neighborly of you." "I try to be." He gestured to the barn. "This property has quite a history. Harold Garrett lived here for, 40 years? Sad that he died alone out here. We tried to check on him, but he preferred his solitude." The lie was smooth, practiced. Harold's documents described years of the Thornburg family trying to buy this property, offering increasingly large sums, which Harold had always refused. "I'm sure," Rebecca said carefully. Robert's eyes moved past her to the barn, assessing. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Hartley. That structure is dangerous. I'm actually on the county planning board, and I'm concerned about liability. If someone were injured on this property—" "I own the property," Rebecca interrupted gently. "Any liability is mine." Of course. I'm just thinking of your well-being." His smile widened slightly. "I'm actually here to make you an offer. I collect historical properties, and I'd like to purchase this barn and land from you. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000, more than 4 times what you paid. You'd make a substantial profit after only a few days of ownership." Rebecca's mind raced. $50,000. That was more than enough to pay off David's medical debts, give her breathing room, start over properly somewhere else. It was a lifeline. It was also proof that there was something here Robert Thornburg desperately wanted. That's very generous, Rebecca said slowly, but I just bought the property. I'd like to spend some time here before making any decisions. Something flickered in Robert's eyes, annoyance, quickly masked. I understand. New property, lots to think about. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. This land has been tied up in county foreclosure for years. It deserves to be properly cared for, and frankly, restoring that barn is going to cost far more than it's worth. My offer would let you walk away with a nice profit and no headaches. I appreciate the offer. If I decide to sell, you'll be the first to know. Robert studied her for a long moment. You know, Harold Garrett was obsessed with local history. He spent his whole life digging into the past, making accusations about things that happened generations ago. It made him unpopular. Isolated. He died alone because he couldn't let old grievances go. The threat was subtle but unmistakable: don't follow Harold's path, or you'll end up like him. I'll keep that in mind, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Robert nodded slowly. I hope you'll be happy here, Ms. Hartley. Pinehaven is a wonderful community for those who fit in. For those who don't. He let the sentence hang, then smiled again. Well, I hope you'll give us a chance. Come by my office in town anytime. The offer stands. He returned to his truck, the younger man, who hadn't said a word, following. They drove away slowly, deliberately, making sure Rebecca watched them go. When the truck disappeared down the trail, Rebecca's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard on the ground, and Ranger pressed against her, whining softly. It's okay, boy, she murmured, but her hands were shaking. They'd come less than 24 hours after she'd arrived. Someone had told them she was here, probably Diane Porter or someone else in the real estate transaction. And Robert Thornburg had immediately offered her 4 times what she'd paid, not even pretending to negotiate. He knew. Maybe he didn't know exactly what Harold had preserved, but he knew there was something in this barn that threatened him. And he was willing to pay to make sure it stayed buried. Rebecca returned to the hidden room and pulled out Harold's most recent notes, the ones from the 1990s and early 2000s. She found what she was looking for, a list of names titled Descendants Still in Area. Hank Morrison, general store owner. Grandson of Thomas Morrison, 160 acres stolen. Grace Chen Rodriguez owns the Timberline Diner. Granddaughter of Robert Chen, sawmill stolen, and daughter-in-law of Maria Rodriguez, 60 acres stolen. James Kowalski, retired teacher. Son of Peter Kowalski, 200 acres stolen. Sarah Nakamura Williams, local nurse. Granddaughter of Henry and Keiko Nakamura, 80 acres stolen under threat of internment. Harold had documented their family histories, tracked their lineages, but there was a note at the bottom: have never approached any of them. Too dangerous while Thornburgs still have power. Wait for right time/right person. The right person. Was that supposed to be Rebecca? She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. Hank had warned her about that. She'd need to go into town to make calls, to use internet, to start connecting with these people. But first, she needed to secure the evidence better than it currently was. If Robert Thornburg decided to send people to search the barn, or worse, to burn it down and claim it was a tragic accident, she needed to make sure the documents couldn't be destroyed. Securing the evidence. Rebecca spent the next several hours working methodically. First, she drove into town, the 30-minute round trip, and purchased a weatherproof storage container, a small portable generator, a battery-powered scanner, extra storage drives, a fireproof document safe, basic tools for reinforcing the hidden room. At the general store, Hank Morrison rang up her purchases with careful attention. Planning to stay a while, he asked, looking at the supplies. Looks that way. Found anything interesting in Harold's barn? Rebecca met his eyes. Should I have? Hank held her gaze for a moment, then said quietly, Harold used to come in here sometimes, late in his life. He'd buy coffee, sit at that table there, he pointed to a small table near the window, and he'd talk. Most people thought he was crazy, rambling about old history. But I listened. My grandfather was Thomas Morrison. Lost his land in 1943. Died bitter and broke. That bitterness passed down through my family like a genetic disease. I'm sorry. Harold said someday someone would find what he'd been keeping safe. Said when that happened, that person should be careful. The Thornburgs don't like their history examined too closely. Hank paused. Robert was here this morning, asking about you. Wanted to know who'd bought Harold's place. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. But he seemed very interested. He came to see me. Made an offer on the property. Hank's eyebrows rose. Did he now? How much? 50,000. Hank let out a low whistle. For that barn? That's 4 times what you paid. He must want it pretty badly. Or want to make sure I don't find something. Or that. Hank finished bagging her purchases. You seem like a smart woman, Ms. Hartley. Smart enough to know when you're getting in over your head? Probably not, Rebecca admitted. But I'm smart enough to know when something's wrong. And what happened to your grandfather, to your family, that was wrong. Hank's expression softened. It was. But that was 80 years ago. Sometimes the past needs to stay past. And sometimes it needs to be brought into the present so it can finally be put to rest properly. Back at the barn, Rebecca set up the generator outside and ran an extension cord to the hidden room. For the next 6 hours, she scanned every single document, creating digital copies that she uploaded to multiple cloud accounts. She organized them by family, by type, by year, creating a comprehensive digital archive. Then she separated the original documents into 2 sets. The most critical originals, the letter from James Thornburg, the testimonies from the families, the property transfer documents showing the fraud, went into the fireproof safe, which she buried in a waterproof container 50 feet from the barn, in a location she carefully marked on her phone's GPS. The remaining documents stayed in the hidden room, but now she had backups of everything. If the barn burned, if the documents were stolen, the evidence would survive. It was nearly dark when she finished. She was exhausted, hungry, and her hands were black with dust and old paper residue. But she'd secured the evidence. Now she needed to figure out who to trust with it. The diner. That evening, Rebecca drove into Pinehaven with Ranger. She needed food, and she needed to start making connections with the descendant families Harold had documented. The Timberline diner was warm and smelled of coffee and home cooking. It was early evening, past the dinner rush but before closing. Only a few customers occupied the booths, older folks nursing coffee, a young couple sharing dessert. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the efficient movements of someone who'd worked in restaurants her entire life. A name tag read Grace. Grace Chen Rodriguez. Granddaughter of Robert Chen, who'd lost his sawmill and 40 acres to Thornburg manipulation in 1943. Rebecca slid onto a counter stool. Ranger waited obediently outside, visible through the window. "What can I get you, hon?" Grace asked, already pouring coffee. "What's good?" "The meatloaf's fresh, comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Or if you want breakfast for dinner, I make a mean omelet." "Meatloaf sounds perfect." Grace called the order to the kitchen, then leaned against the counter. "You're the one who bought Harold's place. News travels fast. Only kind of speed that works in Pinehaven." Grace smiled, but her eyes were assessing. "Harold used to come in here too, before he got too old to drive. Nice man. Sad. Lonely. But nice. Did you know him well?" "Well as anyone did, I suppose. He'd order coffee and pie, sit at that booth there," she pointed to a corner booth, "and sometimes he'd talk. About history, mostly. Things that happened during the war." Her expression grew distant. "My grandmother, my father's mother, she used to tell stories about my great-grandfather Robert Chen. How he'd built a sawmill with his own hands, how he'd been so proud of it. Then the war came, and everything fell apart. Regulations he couldn't meet, equipment that kept breaking, workers who suddenly quit. Eventually he had to sell to Thornburg Timber for almost nothing. It destroyed him. He died young, just 53, from a stroke my grandmother always said was really from a broken heart and broken dreams. Rebecca's own heart was pounding. Did Harold ever talk about that? About your great-grandfather? Grace looked at her sharply. Sometimes. Why? I found some things in the barn. Documents. Historical records that Harold had been keeping. What kind of documents? Rebecca made a decision. She pulled out her phone, found one of the photographs she'd taken, the testimony written by Robert Chin himself, and showed it to Grace. Grace's hands trembled as she held the phone, reading her great-grandfather's words describing exactly what had happened to his business, his family, his dreams. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "Is this real?" she whispered. "It's real. Harold documented everything. Your great-grandfather's story, and 16 other families. All of them destroyed by the Thornburg family during the war." Grace set the phone down carefully, wiping her eyes with her apron. "My father would have wanted to see this. He died 5 years ago, still angry about what his grandfather went through, still bitter that our family never got justice." "There might be a chance for justice now," Rebecca said quietly. "If enough of us come forward." "Us?" "The families who lost everything. If we present this evidence together, if we demand investigation." "The Thornburgs still run this town," Grace interrupted, her voice hard. "Robert Thornburg sits on every board, every committee. His family donates to the school, the library, the fire department. Who's going to believe us over them? People who care about truth. People who care about justice." Grace laughed bitterly. "You don't know this place. You just got here. This isn't the city, where you can call a lawyer and file lawsuits and expect things to work out. This is a small town where a handful of families have all the power and everyone else just survives by not making waves." "Then maybe it's time for some waves," Rebecca said. Grace studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both." The kitchen rang a bell, and Grace retrieved Rebecca's meatloaf, setting it down with practiced efficiency. But before she walked away, she said quietly, "There's a town council meeting next Tuesday night. Robert Thornburg chairs it. If you really want to make waves, that would be the place to start. Will you come? Will you tell your family's story?" Grace hesitated, fear and hope warring on her face. "Let me think about it." "And you should think carefully too. Harold spent his whole life collecting that evidence, and it never changed anything. It just made him a lonely old man that everyone avoided. Sometimes the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of just moving on. Or sometimes," Rebecca said, "the cost of moving on is carrying that weight forever, passing it down to your children and grandchildren until the injustice becomes part of your family's DNA." Grace's eyes filled with tears again. She nodded once, sharply, and walked away to check on other customers. Rebecca ate her meatloaf slowly, thinking. She'd made her first connection. Grace might or might not come to the council meeting, but now she knew. The evidence Harold had preserved wasn't just abstract history, it was her family's story, documented and undeniable. One down. Several more to go. The warning. Rebecca was walking back to her car, Ranger trotting beside her, when a figure emerged from the shadows between buildings. It was the younger man who'd accompanied Robert Thornburg that morning. Up close, he was even more intimidating, 6'3" at least, with the kind of build that came from serious training, not just gym time. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice flat and professional. "A word." Ranger growled low, moving between Rebecca and the stranger. "Your dog should stay calm," the man said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to give you some advice. I didn't ask for any. Sometimes the best advice is the kind we don't ask for." He stepped closer, and Ranger's growl intensified. "My name is Kyle Brennan. I work for Mr. Thornburg in various capacities. Security, mostly. before that, I was military police. I'm good at assessing situations and determining threat levels. Is that what I am? A threat? You could be. Mr. Thornburg made you a generous offer this morning. Much more generous than that property is worth on paper. You should take it. And if I don't? Kyle's expression didn't change. Then you should understand something about Pinehaven. It's a small community. Isolated. Help can be a long time coming if someone has problems. Equipment breaks. Accidents happen. The mountain winters are brutal, pipes freeze, roofs collapse under snow, roads become impassable. A woman alone out there in that old barn. He let the threat hang in the cold night air. Are you threatening me? I'm making sure you understand the reality of your situation. Harold Garrett spent 40 years in that barn digging into history that doesn't matter anymore. He died alone and forgotten. That doesn't have to be your story. And if I make it my story anyway? Kyle studied her for a moment. Then you should be very careful. Watch where you park your car. Check your brakes regularly. Be aware of your surroundings. Accidents happen to people who aren't careful. Especially in the mountains. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he'd appeared. Rebecca stood frozen, her heart hammering. Ranger pressed against her leg, still alert, still protective. She'd been here less than 48 hours, and already she'd been offered a bribe and received a thinly veiled threat. The Thornburg family was moving fast, trying to either buy her silence or intimidate her into leaving. Which meant Harold's evidence was even more dangerous than she'd realized. Back in her car, driving the dark mountain road to the barn, Rebecca's hands shook on the steering wheel. She thought about Grace's words, sometimes the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of moving on. She thought about Kyle Brennan's threats, accidents happen to people who aren't careful. She thought about Robert Thornburg's generous offer, $50,000 for a property worth maybe $15,000. And she thought about David, dying suddenly at 41. About how quickly life could change. About how she'd already lost almost everything. What did she have left to lose except the possibility of doing something that mattered? When she pulled up to the barn, she sat in the darkness for a long time, Ranger patient beside her. Finally, she pulled out her phone and composed an email to 3 investigative journalists whose work she'd followed over the years. She attached selected documents, not everything, but enough to prove she had something substantial. The subject line read, World War II-era land fraud covered up for 80 years, evidence available. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she climbed out of the car and walked into the barn that had become both her refuge and her battleground. The hidden room waited, still filled with decades of secrets. But those secrets wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Rebecca had made her choice. Now she would see it through, whatever the cost. Rebecca woke to the sound of Ranger barking frantically. She'd been sleeping in the CRV again, parked inside the barn's main floor for additional shelter from the December cold. Pale morning light filtered through the gaps in the walls. Her phone showed 6:47 a.m. and 3 missed calls from an unknown Seattle number, along with 2 emails. The first email was from Jennifer Martinez, an investigative journalist with the Seattle Times whose work on corporate corruption Rebecca had followed for years. Ms. Hartley received your materials. This is extraordinary. If you can verify authenticity and connect me with descendant families willing to go on record, this is front-page material. Can you meet in Millbrook today? I'm driving up from Seattle. Will arrive by 2 p.m. Reply ASAP. Jennifer Martinez. The second email was from Marcus Webb, a documentary filmmaker who specialized in historical injustices. Rebecca, your story is exactly what we've been looking for. Systematic fraud, powerful families, buried evidence spanning generations. This is the kind of thing that changes communities. I'm in Portland but can be in Washington by tomorrow. We need to talk. Marcus. Rebecca's heart pounded as she read the messages. 24 hours ago she'd been alone with this burden. Now serious journalists were responding, wanting to help expose the truth. She quickly replied to both, agreeing to meet Jennifer that afternoon and setting up a call with Marcus for the next day. But Ranger was still barking, his attention focused on the barn's entrance. Rebecca climbed out of the sleeping bag and peered through a gap in the wall. A Pinehaven Sheriff's patrol car was parked in the clearing. The sheriff's visit. Deputy Tom Crawford was young, maybe 30, with the slightly uncomfortable bearing of someone who hadn't quite grown into his authority. He stood beside his patrol car, looking at the barn with obvious uncertainty. Rebecca stepped out, Ranger at her side but silent now, watching the deputy with focused intensity. "Miss Hartley," the deputy called. "I'm Deputy Crawford. Sorry to bother you so early, but I need to talk to you about a complaint we received." "What kind of complaint?" Crawford pulled out a small notebook. "Mr. Robert Thornburg called the station last night. Said you've been trespassing on his property, removing historical documents that belong to his family. He's requesting that we investigate and recover any materials you might have taken." Rebecca's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "I haven't trespassed on anyone's property. I own this land. I have the deed." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that. But Mr. Thornburg claims that certain historical documents belonging to his family were stored here by Harold Garrett without permission, and those documents are actually Thornburg property." "That's not true. Harold Garrett collected these documents legally. They're evidence of—" "Ma'am," Crawford interrupted, looking uncomfortable, "I'm not here to argue about history. I'm here because a complaint was filed. Mr. Thornburg is within his rights to request an investigation. Now, I don't have a warrant, so I can't search your property. But I'm asking as a courtesy, do you have any documents that might belong to the Thornburg family?" Rebecca made a split-second decision. "Deputy Crawford, what I have are documents proving that the Thornburg family committed systematic fraud during World War II, stealing land from 17 families in this valley. Harold Garrett spent his life documenting those crimes. That's what Robert Thornburg wants back, evidence of his family's criminal activity." Crawford's expression shifted, surprise, then concern, then careful neutrality. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's a serious crime. One that's been covered up for 80 years. Do you have proof of these allegations?" "I have extensive proof. Property records, testimonies from victims, even letters from James Thornburg himself describing how to exploit wartime chaos for financial gain. I've already contacted journalists. This is going public whether the Thornburg family likes it or not." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Hartley, I'm going to give you some advice. Off the record." He glanced around as if checking for listening devices. "Robert Thornburg has a lot of influence in this county. A lot. The sheriff, my boss, he's been sheriff for 26 years, and the Thornburg family has supported every one of his campaigns. I'm not saying Sheriff Morrison is corrupt, but I am saying that going up against the Thornburgs is going to be harder than you think." "Sheriff Morrison?" Rebecca's mind raced. "Is he related to Hank Morrison?" "His brother. Hank's the older brother, runs the general store. Sheriff Morrison is younger. They're descendants of Thomas Morrison, who lost land back in the 40s. It's kind of an open secret around here, though nobody talks about it much." "Does the sheriff know about his family history?" "About what happened?" Crawford shrugged. "I don't know what he knows. But I do know that he's not going to appreciate an outsider coming in and stirring up trouble about things that happened before any of us were born. Even if those things explain why his family has struggled for generations. Especially then. Sometimes people would rather not know." Crawford closed his notebook. "Look, I'm going to file a report saying I came out here, talked to you, and that you denied having any Thornburg property. That'll satisfy the paperwork requirement. But Miss Hartley, Rebecca, you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about history. This is about power, money, and people who've built their entire identity on being the founding family of Pinehaven. They're not going to let you destroy that without a fight. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to expose the truth. Sometimes that's the same thing." Crawford headed back to his patrol car, then paused. One more thing. Be careful at night. Check your vehicle before you drive anywhere, brakes, tires, that sort of thing. We've had reports of vandalism in remote areas lately. Is that an official warning? It's friendly advice. He climbed into his car and drove away, leaving Rebecca standing in the cold morning air with a German shepherd and a barn full of evidence that powerful people wanted buried. Gathering the families. Rebecca spent the morning making calls from the one spot near the barn where her phone caught a weak signal. She contacted every descendant family member Harold had documented, asking them to meet with her and journalist Jennifer Martinez that afternoon in Millbrook. The responses varied. Hank Morrison agreed immediately. I've waited my whole life for this. Count me in. Grace Chen Rodriguez was hesitant but finally agreed. My husband thinks I'm crazy. But I'll come. My father would have wanted someone to fight for him. James Kowalski, the retired teacher, was skeptical but curious. I'll listen to what you have to say. But I'm not making any promises. Sarah Nakamura Williams, the nurse, was emotional. My grandmother died still angry about what happened to her parents. She'd want me to be there. By noon, Rebecca had commitments from 6 descendant family members to meet with the journalist. It wasn't all 17 families, but it was a start. She spent the remaining time before the meeting preparing materials, printing out the most damning documents at a Millbrook copy shop, organizing them into folders for each family, making sure she had backup copies of everything. The Millbrook meeting. The Millbrook Public Library had a meeting room that could be reserved for free. Rebecca had booked it for the afternoon, and by 2 p.m., 8 people were gathered around a long table: Rebecca, 6 descendant family members, and Jennifer Martinez. Jennifer was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a recording device that she set on the table with everyone's permission. I want to thank you all for coming. What Rebecca has shown me is potentially one of the most significant stories of wartime fraud and generational injustice I've encountered. But I need your help to tell it properly. She looked around the table. I need your family's stories. I need you to go on record, to let me publish your names and your connection to what happened. I know that's asking a lot, especially in a small community where the family responsible for this fraud still has power. But without your voices, this is just old documents. With your voices, it's justice finally being served. Hank Morrison spoke first. My grandfather Thomas Morrison was a proud man. Worked his whole life to buy 160 acres of prime timber land. When the Thornburgs stole it from him through manipulated taxes, it broke something in him. He died at 62, worn out and bitter. My father inherited that bitterness, passed it to me. I've spent my whole life knowing my family should have been wealthy landowners, and instead we're barely getting by. If telling my story can finally set that record straight, I'll tell it 1,000 times. Grace Chen Rodriguez nodded, her eyes wet. My great-grandfather Robert Chen built a sawmill with his own hands. The Thornburgs destroyed it through regulations they didn't have to follow themselves. He died young, and my grandmother raised her children alone, poor, struggling. Every generation of my family has carried that weight. My father died 5 years ago still angry about it. I want him to be remembered for more than just his anger. I want people to know what was taken from us. One by one, the others shared their stories. The patterns were heartbreakingly similar: proud families building something from nothing, then having it systematically destroyed by people with more power, more connections, more ruthlessness. Generations of struggle, of poverty, of bitterness, all traceable to a few years during World War II when the Thornburg family had recognized an opportunity and exploited it without mercy. Jennifer recorded everything, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, her expression growing more determined as the stories unfolded. This is going to be a major story, she said when everyone had spoken. But I need to warn you, the Thornburgs will fight back. They'll claim these documents are forgeries. They'll attack your credibility. They'll use their influence to try to suppress publication. Are you all prepared for that? What choice do we have? Sarah Nakamura Williams asked quietly. Stay silent and let the injustice continue? Let our children inherit the same bitterness we did? No. I'm done being silent. Rebecca felt something shift in the room, a collective decision, a commitment. These people had lived their entire lives in the shadow of their family's stolen futures. Now, finally, they had a chance to step into the light. There's a town council meeting on Tuesday night, Rebecca said. Robert Thornburg chairs it. I'm planning to present this evidence publicly at that meeting. If we all attend, if we all speak. That's dangerous, James Kowalski interrupted. Robert Thornburg is not a man who accepts humiliation gracefully. If you confront him publicly like that, then we confront him together, Hank said firmly. Rebecca's right. The town council meeting is public. It's recorded. If we present this evidence there, in front of the whole community, it becomes part of the official record. They can't bury it. I'll be there, Grace said. Me too, Sarah added. One by one, they all agreed. 6 families, spanning 3 generations of injustice, committing to stand together and finally demand accountability. Jennifer Martinez smiled. This is going to be one hell of a story. My article will run in the Seattle Times the morning after the council meeting. That way, even if things go badly at the meeting, the evidence is already public. They can't suppress it. As the meeting broke up, Rebecca felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. They were really doing this. In 3 days, they would confront one of the most powerful families in the region with evidence of crimes spanning 80 years. The Thornburgs wouldn't go down without a fight. The escalation. That night, Rebecca returned to the barn to find that someone had been there. The main barn door, which she'd left closed, was hanging open. Inside, equipment had been moved, hay bales shifted, as if someone had been searching for something. Heart pounding, Rebecca checked the hidden room. The false wall was still in place, undisturbed. Whoever had searched hadn't found it. But they'd been close, very close. Ranger moved through the barn, his hackles up, growling at shadows. Someone's scent was fresh enough to agitate him. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Last warning. Take the money and leave. What comes next is on you. She called Deputy Crawford immediately. He arrived within 30 minutes, taking notes about the break-in, photographing the disturbance. I'll file a report, he said, but honestly, without witnesses or clear evidence of who was here, there's not much we can do. Could have been kids, could have been someone looking for salvage. This old barn has probably been a target for metal scrappers for years. It was the Thornburgs. You know it was. Crawford's expression was sympathetic but helpless. I can't investigate based on assumptions, Ms. Hartley. I need evidence. After he left, Rebecca stood in the barn, Ranger pressed against her leg, and made a decision. She couldn't stay here alone anymore. It wasn't safe. She called Hank Morrison. They broke into the barn tonight, she said without preamble. Searched it. I got a threatening text. Hank was quiet for a moment. Come to my house. I have a guest room. You and your dog can stay here until after the council meeting. It's not safe for you out there alone. I can't put you in danger. Rebecca, I'm 73 years old. I've lived my whole life under the Thornburg shadow. If they want to come after me now, let them try. Come to town. There's safety in numbers. Rebecca packed her essential belongings, made sure the hidden room was secure, and drove to Pinehaven. Hank's house was a modest 2-story on the edge of town, warm and cluttered with books and family photos. He showed her to a small guest room with faded wallpaper and a comfortable bed. You're safe here. And we'll all be at that council meeting on Tuesday. The Thornburgs won't try anything with the whole town watching. Rebecca wasn't so sure, but she was grateful for the shelter and the solidarity. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Jennifer Martinez's article was written and scheduled. Marcus Webb, the documentary filmmaker, arrived and began filming interviews with the descendant families. The story was taking shape, becoming real, undeniable. But the pressure from the Thornburg family intensified. Grace's diner received a surprise health inspection that found multiple violations that had never been cited before despite the diner operating successfully for 30 years. She was given 2 weeks to make expensive repairs or face closure. Sarah Nakamura Williams was called into her supervisor's office at the hospital and questioned about her outside activities and whether they might reflect poorly on the institution. James Kowalski received a letter from a law firm representing the Thornburg family, threatening legal action for defamation if he made any public statements about the family. The message was clear: back down, or face consequences. None of them backed down. "They can threaten me all they want," Grace said when they all gathered at Hank's house the evening before the council meeting. "I've already lost so much because of what they did to my family. I'm not losing my voice too." Rebecca showed them the final presentation she'd prepared, a clear, documented timeline of the fraud, with copies of the original documents, photographs of the families affected, and a comparison of what those families lost versus what the Thornburg family gained. "Tomorrow night," she said, "we tell this story to the whole town. And then we let the chips fall where they may." The town council meeting. The Pinehaven Town Hall was a modest building on Main Street, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 60 people. By 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday evening, it was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread about what was coming, and it seemed like half the town had shown up. Robert Thornburg sat at the council table, flanked by 4 other council members. His expression was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could see tension in his shoulders, calculation in his eyes. In the audience, Rebecca sat with Hank, Grace, Sarah, James, and the other descendant family members. Jennifer Martinez was there with a photographer. Marcus Webb had cameras set up to film the meeting. Deputy Crawford stood near the door, looking uncomfortable. The meeting opened with routine business, budget items, zoning questions, permit approvals. Robert Thornburg ran it with smooth efficiency, his voice calm and authoritative. Then came the public comment period. Rebecca stood, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address the council about a matter of historical importance to this community." Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The public comment period is for current issues, not history lessons." "This history explains current issues," Rebecca replied. "It explains why certain families in Pinehaven have prospered while others have struggled for generations. It explains patterns of wealth and poverty that have shaped this community for 80 years. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Robert's expression hardened. "Ms. Hartley, I'm aware you've been making wild accusations about my family. I'm willing to give you 5 minutes to speak, but I warn you, defamation has legal consequences." "Truth is not defamation, Mr. Thornburg." Rebecca pulled out her presentation materials. "In 1942, your grandfather James Thornburg began a systematic campaign to acquire privately owned timber land in this valley by fraudulent means. Over the next 3 years, 17 families lost their property through manipulated tax assessments, selectively enforced regulations, and forced sales during wartime when families had no ability to fight back." She held up the first document, James Thornburg's letter to his son. "This is your grandfather's own words, describing how to exploit the war for financial gain. Business is not about fairness, it's about recognizing opportunity when it presents itself." The room erupted. People shouting questions, Robert Thornburg slamming his gavel, demanding order. Rebecca continued, her voice rising above the chaos. "Harold Garrett spent his entire adult life documenting these crimes. He preserved property records, testimonies from victims, correspondence from your grandfather. And now, those documents are being made public." She gestured to the descendant families. These people's families lost everything because of fraud committed by the Thornburg family. Hank Morrison's grandfather lost 160 acres. Grace Chen Rodriguez's great-grandfather lost his sawmill and livelihood. Sarah Nakamura Williams's great-grandparents were threatened with internment camps if they didn't sell their land for pennies on the dollar. One by one, the descendants stood, each speaking about their family's experience, their voices strong despite decades of silence. Robert Thornburg's face had gone from carefully neutral to flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. These are lies, slander against my family's good name. Those documents are forgeries, or they're being wildly misinterpreted." "They're neither," Rebecca said calmly. "They've been authenticated by historians and legal experts. Tomorrow morning, the Seattle Times will publish a comprehensive article about this fraud. By the end of the week, the Attorney General's office will have copies of all evidence. The truth is coming out, Mr. Thornburg, whether you like it or not." "You have no right," Robert started to say, but he was drowned out by the audience. Some were shouting in support of Rebecca and the families. Others were defending the Thornburgs, calling this a witch hunt. The meeting had devolved into chaos, decades of buried resentment and unspoken history finally erupting into the open. Sheriff Morrison, Hank's younger brother, stepped forward, his expression conflicted. "Everyone needs to calm down. These are serious allegations, and they need to be investigated properly, not screamed about in a town hall meeting." "They've been investigated," Rebecca said, looking directly at the sheriff. "Your own grandfather was one of the victims, Sheriff Morrison. Thomas Morrison lost 160 acres that should have been your family's inheritance. Don't you think you deserve to know the truth about what happened?" Sheriff Morrison's face went pale. He looked at his brother Hank, who nodded slowly, confirming what Rebecca had said. "Is that true?" the sheriff asked quietly. "It's true," Hank replied. "I've known for years. Harold Garrett told me. But what could I do? Go up against the Thornburgs alone? I had a business to run, a family to support. I stayed quiet, like everyone else." His voice broke. "I stayed quiet, and I'm ashamed of it." The room fell silent. Robert Thornburg stood slowly, his composure cracking for the first time. "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene when everyone has calmed down and can discuss this rationally." "You can adjourn the meeting," Jennifer Martinez called out, standing. "But you can't adjourn the truth. My article publishes tomorrow. The state attorney general has already been contacted. An investigation is coming, Mr. Thornburg. The only question is whether you cooperate or obstruct." Robert Thornburg looked around the room, at the faces of people he'd known his whole life, people whose families had been victimized by his grandfather's fraud, people who'd stayed silent out of fear or social pressure or simple exhaustion. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps recognition that the battle was lost. He sat down heavily. "I need time to review these documents. If there's truth to what you're saying," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "If my grandfather did what you claim, then my family bears responsibility for that. But I need time. This can't be resolved tonight." "We've waited 80 years, Hank said quietly. "You can have a little time. But not much." The aftermath 6 months later. The mountain meadow was brilliant with summer wildflowers, purple lupin, yellow balsamroot, white avalanche lilies. Rebecca sat on the porch of the small cabin she'd built next to the barn, Ranger sprawled at her feet, watching the sun set behind the Cascades. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind. Jennifer Martinez's article had run on the front page of the Seattle Times, sparking state and federal investigations. The Attorney General's office had launched a formal inquiry into the Thornburg family's land acquisitions during the 1940s. The investigation confirmed everything Harold Garrett had documented. The fraud was real, systematic, and devastating. Robert Thornburg had resigned from the town council and all his civic positions. The Thornburg family had agreed to a settlement, a $12 million fund to compensate the descendant families, with amounts determined by what their ancestors had lost. It wasn't full justice. Money couldn't restore the generations of struggle, the broken dreams, the opportunities stolen. But it was acknowledgement. It was recognition that what happened was wrong. The barn still stood, but now it was being renovated into a community center and museum. The hidden room would be preserved as an exhibit, honoring Harold Garrett's lifetime of work preserving the truth. Hank Morrison had been the first to receive his share of the settlement, enough to secure his retirement and pass something meaningful to his children and grandchildren. Grace Chen Rodriguez had used her portion to finally buy the diner building outright, securing her family's business for future generations. Sheriff Morrison had attended every hearing, sitting in the front row, learning the truth about his family's history. He and Hank had reconciled, their relationship healing after years of distance and unspoken resentment. As for Rebecca, she'd used her portion of the settlement. She'd been included as the person who'd exposed the fraud and preserved the evidence, to pay off David's medical debts and build a small, efficient cabin on the property. She'd started teaching again, this time at Pinehaven's small elementary school, and had found something she'd thought was lost forever: purpose, community, home. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Dinner at the diner? My treat. We're celebrating the museum groundbreaking." Rebecca smiled, typing back, "I'll be there." She stood, stretching, and Ranger immediately jumped up, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. "Come on, boy," Rebecca said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's go see our friends." As she drove the now familiar road into Pinehaven, she thought about Harold Garrett, who'd died alone in that barn, surrounded by evidence that no one had been willing to see. He'd never known that his life's work would finally bear fruit. Never knew that someone would find his carefully preserved truth and have the courage to share it. Never knew that justice, however delayed, would eventually come. But Rebecca knew. And she'd made sure that Harold's story was part of the museum, that his name was honored, that people would remember he'd spent his life fighting for what was right, even when it seemed hopeless. Sometimes the right person does come along. Sometimes the truth does surface. Sometimes justice, however long delayed, finally arrives. And sometimes, a broken woman buying an abandoned barn with her last dollars finds not just property, but purpose. Not just shelter, but a community. Not just survival, but a reason to live. The mountains rose behind her, eternal and beautiful. The town spread before her, no longer hostile but welcoming. And somewhere in the evening air, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of an old man's voice, finally able to rest. The truth had been told. Justice had been served. And a community that had been divided by decades of buried history was finally beginning to heal. Rebecca pulled into a parking spot in front of the Timberline Diner. Through the window, she could see Hank, Grace, Sarah, James, and others gathered around a large table, laughing, talking, celebrating. Her people. Her community. Her home. She'd come to Pinehaven with nothing but grief and debt and a German Shepherd. She'd found something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that one person, armed with truth and courage, could change the world. Or at least change one small mountain town. And sometimes, that was enough.